everyone, Miss Howell here. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Today we're going to be talking about the beginning of the Middle Ages, focusing on geography and the church. So just kind of taking a walk down memory lane, we know a lot about the fall of the Roman Empire. That was the last portion of the unit that we talked about in ancient Rome. So we know that the fall of the Roman Empire kind of had this culmination of things that happened that ultimately led to the falling. And just to refresh our memories a little bit, we had that barbarian invasion, quite a few bad emperors, bad rulers coming in and messing things up. And also some detriments to the economy. There was a lack of money, and all of those things added up together really led to the fall of the Roman Empire and the end of Rome. But we want to talk a little bit about what actually happened after the fall of the Roman Empire. So here's what happened. When we were talking about the Roman Empire, you guys know we mostly focused on the western portion of Rome because that was the portion of the Roman Empire that really fell. The eastern portion, however, that was the Persian part. The eastern portion never totally fell. And what's interesting is that the eastern portion kind of transitioned over into a new empire that we're going to be discussing today called the Byzantine Empire. And you guys can see up here, there's these two portions of land. So we have the portions that are in orange as well as the portions that are in pink. All of those areas of land are eventually going to become a part of the Byzantine Empire, which is essentially a very large area of land over in that eastern part of Europe. Couple of things that are interesting about the Byzantine Empire that we want you guys to know. Again, the Byzantine Empire ruled over the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, or what used to be known as the Roman Empire. Something that was also interesting, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about the religion today, but they ruled over most of the Christian religious sites, which is important to know because most of the Byzantine Empire was actually Muslim. And if you guys don't remember, or you need to refresh your memory a little bit about the religion of Islam, we talked about that in Unit 2. So just some quick reminders. First of all, Islam is a monotheistic religion, meaning that they only believe in one God, one higher being. They follow the teachings of their prophet named Muhammad, and they also believe in Allah. So talking a little bit more about what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire, we want to know what happened to the western portion. So something that's interesting that really happened into, kind of transitioning over from the fall of the Roman Empire, how did that land get split up? Well, it became very fragmented, which means that it was split up in a lot of different ways. You guys can see up here on the map, there are multiple different colors. And that's because those territories were being claimed by multiple different people, okay? That's why we have so many colors up there, is because people were claiming lands left and right, claiming them all over the place, and that is how it becomes very fragmented. This is now going to enter us into the time that we are calling the Dark Ages. So why do historians actually call this time in history the Dark Ages, the Medieval Ages, the Middle Ages? There are so many different names for this time period in history. I like to call it the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, particularly because, first of all, the reasoning behind the Dark Ages is because this is really a time in history that we don't know a ton about. It kind of goes black a little bit. We don't have a lot of information about many things that happened during this time, but there are quite a few key moments that we will be talking about. This is just a time where most people were not very educated, and we didn't see a lot of innovation, not a lot of technology coming up. And that is because there was so much lack of education and lack of movement that we almost consider this to be a transitional period in history, because we're coming from the Roman Empire and the Pax Romana, where we had so much innovation, so much peace and happiness. And then we're getting this transitional period. And then later on in the future, which we're going to be talking about in a later unit, we do get a lot of innovation and a lot of really great, interesting things happening. This is kind of a middle ground, a middle time where we don't see a whole lot of innovation, but still some really, really interesting things happening. And I know that as teachers, this is one of our favorite units that we get to teach because so much of the information that is in here is so fun to teach and just very, very interesting. So, what are some of the characteristics of the Dark Ages? So, we know that the Dark Ages were sometime between 500 and 1500 AD. We also mentioned earlier in the previous slide that this is a time in history that we don't know very much about. Even though we are going to be talking about some really interesting things, we don't have a lot of information about a lot of things that happened during this time period. Couple of things that we do know, though, for certain is that, once again, there was not a lot of education, not a lot of innovation. Most people during this time did not know how to read or write. And there was also a lot of warfare happening at this time. You remember on one of the previous slides, we talked about how the land was so fragmented. Well, there was a lot of fighting occurring at this time about who was going to take control over certain lands. So a lot of warfare occurred and a lot of fighting broke out. Even though that there was a lot of fighting during this time period of the Dark Ages, something that kind of helped people come together a little bit was the church and religion. So Christianity back then gave people something that they had in common, something that they could share together and kind of find some common ground with. It is important to know for you guys that back then, Christian meant Catholic. That is not the same meaning today. We know, as we talked about Christianity back again in Unit 2, that there are many different divisions and branches of Christianity. But back during this time of the Dark Ages, to be Christian simply meant that you were Catholic. Something that's really, really important for you guys to know about the church during this time is that the church was an extremely powerful position, okay? They were extremely powerful and were in charge of the government, art, education, daily life of the common person, pretty much every single aspect of life the church was in charge of, or at least a part of in some way. So I want you guys to answer that question there on the slide. Why was the church in charge of people and their lives? And why was the church so impactful? Kind of breaking down a little bit, the organization of the Catholic Church is something that is important for you guys to know. So this is kind of the hierarchy that we have in the Catholic Church back in the Dark Ages. At the top was God. Below was the Pope. We had the archbishops, the bishops, the priests, the monks and nuns, and then at the bottom was the ordinary people. We're going to talk a little bit more about each of those roles here in just a second. So kind of touching on the roles that we talked about in the Catholic Church just a little bit more. First off, we have the Pope. The Pope is really the one who is the big boss, the one who is in charge. The definition listed up here for you guys says the Pope is the head of the church, head of the Catholic Church, to be exact. They make the decisions about the religion as well as the government. And then we have the priests. So the priests are the men who have a little bit of a higher status in the church. So they're not the boss, but they're pretty up there. Think of a good example of this one as like a supervisor at Walmart. Okay. And then we have the nuns, and that is correlated to this picture right here. The nuns are women who are dedicated to serving their lives to God, and they live in convents, which are essentially places that nuns can live all together, and they never marry. And then finally, we have the monks. Monks are men that serve God, and they live in monasteries. These are very similar to nuns. They all live together in the monasteries, and they never wed as well. So why was the church so important to people during the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages? First of all, they gave people an education. And as we talked about, there was not a lot of education happening during the Dark Ages. So this was a really great asset for people to use to get the education that they needed to get by in life. Something else that was important that they did was helping out poor people. We're going to be talking a little bit later on in this lesson about how people gave money to the church and how they donated a portion of their salary to help out funding the church and help out poor people as well. The church also helped to create a balanced government. They wanted to make sure that everyone was, whoever was in power, was giving equal amounts of rights to everybody, and just making sure that everything was very balanced and that there was no corruption of power. The church helped to determine the laws, and this was very important because they wanted to, again, have a place in the government and making sure that everything was fair for the people. And this is where we get the idea of canon law coming in. Canon law translates into church law, so these are laws that were actually made by the church or help support the church, or again, just kind of translates, once again, canon law into church law. Those were created by the church. So here are some of the beliefs of the Catholic Church for you guys. First off, we get the belief in Jesus. They did believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. They also believe in heaven. They believe in an afterlife, a place that people go to after they die. We're going to touch on this one a little bit more here later on in the assignment, but they also believed that people should be giving a portion of their salary to the church. This was about 10% of their earnings usually. And they also believed that people should take a pilgrimage, which is essentially a long journey that they should be taking by themselves to go and visit holy shrines in their lands.